My name is Cale Carter, and today we're going to start on introducing y'all to Black Infantry Regiments in World War II. Now, for context, the U.S. Army did actually have Black Infantry Regiments during the interwar period, and the Black Infantry Regiments that the Army had were spread out across three areas: the regular Army, the National Guard, as well as the reserves. In the case of the regular Army had two Black Infantry Regiments. They were the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. Now, in previous videos, I did talk a little bit about those units and more specifically their history on the Western frontier, as well as during the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. So, in addition to those two units, the U.S. Army did have three Black National Guard infantry regiments. And for context, the blacks did serve in the National Guard, and there were Black National Guard units during the interwar period. However, the vast majority were concentrated in the Northeast and the Midwest. So, as I mentioned before, there are three Black National Guard regiments. The first one is the 8th Illinois, which is obviously out of Illinois. The second would be the 15th New York National Guard, better known as the 369th Infantry or the Harlem Hellfighters. And the last one will be the 372nd Infantry Regiment, which consisted of Black National Guardsmen that came from Washington, D.C., Ohio, Massachusetts, and even New Jersey. The last category of Black Infantry Regiments during the interwar period was the Black Infantry Regiments that were part of the reserves. And if you go read the U.S. Army Order of Battle between 1919 and 1941, one of the interesting things you find is that on paper there are a lot of Black infantry regiments that were classified as being part of the reserves. But in actuality, of all those Black infantry regiments, only a handful were actually active during this period. And for the sake of the video, I'm going to focus on name out three that were active during that period. They were the 428th Infantry Regiment, the 447th Infantry Regiment, and the 449th Infantry Regiment. Now, the interesting thing about Black infantry regiments in the reserve, they actually served a dual purpose. So their first mission was primarily to educate and serve as a feeder unit for Army ROTC cadets that were coming from HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. So in the case of the 428th Infantry Regiment, they served as a feeder unit for ROTC cadets coming from Howard University. And in the case of the 447th Infantry Regiment, they served as a feeder unit for Army ROTC cadets coming from Tuskegee Institute, or as we now know it, Tuskegee University. Now, in addition to serving as feeders for Army ROTC cadets coming from HBCUs, the Black Reserve Infantry Regiments also served another purpose, and that was to assist in training for the Civilian Military Training Corps, or the CMTC. Now, the idea behind the CMTC was that you would take civilians who might want to get some military training, but they may not have the time to dedicate to being a part of, like, say for example, a National Guard unit. So you bring them in and you're train them and you give them military training, but at the same time they don't have the same level of commitment to the Army that soldiers in the National Guard or the regular Army may have. So, and of course the idea too was to try to help provide more experience to, like, military age civilians, so that way if a war did break out, the U.S. Army would have a ready pool of recruits to pull from, and they would already be acclimated to some of the drills and everything else that came with Army life. So when World War II got started, ultimately 11 Black infantry regiments were created, and of the 11, 6 were attached to two of the black infantry divisions. In the case of the 93rd Infantry Division had the 25th Infantry Regiment, the 368th, and the 369th. In the case of the 92nd Infantry Division, they had the 365th Infantry, the 370th, and the 371st. Now, initially, before World War II, the U.S. Army relied on a square division format. And the square division format meant that every division, infantry division, for example, would have two infantry brigades and a total of 4 infantry regiments, that were a part of the division. However, prior to World War II, the U.S. Army started to triangularize the divisions, and as a result, every division shed an extra infantry regiment. So in the case of the black infantry regiments, a lot of them were, a good chunk of them ended up serving as independent regiments in various theaters. Now, in terms of the theater that received the most black infantry regiments, that honor would actually go to the Pacific Theater, because in the case of the Pacific Theater, you had the 3 infantry regiments that was attached to the 93rd Infantry Division, which I mentioned them before. The 24th Infantry Regiment was also sent to the Pacific Theater, and lastly, the 364th Infantry Regiment was deployed to the Pacific Theater, and I'll cover those units' experiences in more detail when I cover those units individually. The 366th Infantry Regiment was sent to Italy along with the regiments that were a part of the 92nd Infantry Division. And one of the more interesting notes was that the 367th Infantry Regiment, well, by this point became a battalion, they were sent to Liberia. And I will go into more details when I cover the 367th Infantry Regiment, but I still found it interesting that they actually sent a black unit to Liberia, but I'll explain why when I get to that video. Now, also because of the issues that occurred during World War II, other black infantry units were created either out of necessity or even in some cases as experiments. So in the case of the black infantry regiments that were created out of necessity, that would go to units that are colloquially known as the 5th platoons. Now, for context behind that, towards the end of World War II, the U.S. Army was going through a manpower shortage. They needed, like, the draft calls. The draft calls were being reduced stateside, and of course, the white divisions that were in combat in Europe, they needed a steady stream of replacements because soldiers would either get killed or wounded, and they needed soldiers to replace them. So the idea was that soldiers who were in rear echelon positions would either volunteer or get voluntold to get attached to the understrength white divisions. In the case of the black soldiers, there were black soldiers who were from rear echelon positions that actually volunteered to serve alongside white divisions that were seeing heavy combat. And of course, what happened in those situations, those black soldiers were, again, because of the rules of the U.S. Army at the time period, they were kept in the segregated platoon and commanded by a white officer, but they were still attached to a white regiment or a white division. Now, the last infantry unit that was created during World War II that's actually pretty interesting and does not get the recognition that it deserves is the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. Now, as I mentioned before, during World War II, because of the advocacy of black newspapers as well as black advocacy groups like the NAACP, the U.S. Army was made to at least have proportional representation of the black community throughout all its branches. So that included infantry, artillery, and even in the case of the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, this new branch of the Army that focused on airborne operations. So I won't go into too much detail about them because I'll cover them in a separate video, but one interesting fact I will bring up about the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion is that after World War II, the U.S. Army created its first and only Black Ranger Company, which was the 2nd Ranger Company. And a good chunk of the staff who helped build the 2nd Ranger Company came from the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. So, with all that said, this video pretty much is going to serve as kind of a basic introduction to the Black Infantry Regiments I'll be covering in the next set of, in this series of videos. The first infantry regiment I'll be talking about will be the 24th Infantry Regiment, and from there I will talk about the 25th, 364th, and so on and so forth. So that is the end of this video. I hope y'all enjoyed the information that I gave. I hope y'all learned something new. And otherwise, I hope you have a good evening. So if you take time, just please subscribe to the channel, or if you made it this far, I would say comment 447th Infantry. And now, of course, I explained why it's significant earlier. But with all that said, thank you, and y'all have a great night.